Welcome to Alan Skorsky Reports. I'm Alan Skorsky. For years, anti-Semitism from the left has been rising and become normalized. It started with President Barack Obama, who worshiped in a church led by an America-hating preacher named Jeremiah Wright. While speaking at the University of Cairo, President Obama made a moral equivalence between the Holocaust and the Palestinian cause. Obama vowed to create daylight between the United States and Israel, and at the same time elevated the anti-Israel lobbyist group J Street to neutralize the work of AIPAC. Barack Obama opened the doors to the squad, led by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar. And that group gave rise and prominence to a new and radical anti-Semitic progressive wing of the Democratic Party. The final stake driven through the hearts of American Jews was the recent election of an avowed America-hating, cop-bashing, anti-Semitic jihadist who stated that his identity is tied to Palestine, and of course we're talking about Zoran Mamdani. Today's guest is famed author Uri Kaufman, whose new book, American Intifada, Israel, the Gaza War, and the New Antisemitism, delves in great depth about how and why progressives have become active in virulent anti-Semitism while they embrace the murderous cause of Hamas, as well as how did October 7th ever happen. Uri Kaufman's other books include 18 Days in October, the Yom Kippur War and How It Created the Modern Middle East, which was selected by the Financial Times in 2023 as one of the year's best history books. Uri Kaufman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So I have a whole bunch of questions because your book tackles so many topics that are very dear to me that I've been railing against for the last few years. I'm not going into any particular order, but in your book, you did single out a few villains like Barack Obama and J Street. So as I mentioned in my monologue, yes, Jimmy Carter was anti-Semitic, Bill Clinton had Oslo, but Barack Obama really opened the door and normalized anti-Semitism. J Street, also terrible, terrible group. Both of them have a lot of blood on their hands as far as I'm concerned. So talk about, what you, in your book, how you saw them as part of the American Intifada.
Well, if you go back to the October 7, 2023 massacre perpetrated by Hamas, right after it happened, maybe a week or two later, President Obama tweeted that no one's hands are clean. That's a direct quote. Right. And that's a pretty striking thing to say. No one's hands are clean. You're drawing a moral equivalence. And now this was, I think it was actually on October the 23rd, which was before Israeli troops had even gone into Gaza. So why the moral equivalence? Well, he said the moral equivalence. It was because he said the, quote, occupation left the plight of the Palestinians, quote, unbearable, unquote. Now, occupation unbearable? There was no occupation. Israel had withdrawn from Gaza over 18 years before. There wasn't a single Israeli soldier or settler there. They'd actually even dug up their dead and taken them back. There wasn't a Jewish molecule in Gaza. So what's the occupation? What's he talking about? So it was obvious that he said something that was just factually inaccurate. Barack Obama was also, while he was president, was one of only two presidents that actually took a position that was more anti-Israel than the Arabs did at that time. At the time that Barack Obama was, the other one was Jimmy Carter. Barack Obama, when he was president, there had been a quiet understanding that Israel could continue to build settlements in the so-called settlement blocks because even the Palestinians acknowledged Israel would keep this land. Now, the Palestinians wanted a land swap, complicated piece of business, but the point is, in the settlement blocks, you had this elegant compromise. You could build in the settlement blocks because Israel's going to keep that land anyway. The Palestinians said so. Well, came Barack Obama and said, well, you can't build there either. Now, the Palestinians can't be less anti-Israel than an American president. So they said, yeah, you can't build there either. So basically, Obama took the only thing the two sides agreed upon and he opened it up and put it back into controversy. So it raises an obvious question, and the obvious question is why? Why would he do something like this? Why is he so anti-Israel? Especially when you consider, by the way, that all his early donors, when he was, unknown in Chicago, were Jews.
Right.
So I think the best way to understand it is by engaging in a thought experiment. So let's go back to the October 7 attack. So you had 1,200 people murdered, 251 hostages, many, many women raped. Um, According to every opinion poll, the Palestinian people universally supported the attack. Palestinians regularly refer to Jews as apes and pigs. They do that because there's a verse in the Quran that says that. And anyone who doesn't believe me, just go on Google, type in Palestine apes and pigs or Jews apes and pigs. Scroll with your mouse, you'll see literally dozens of quotes. One last fact, the Biden administration budgeted billions of dollars of aid for rebuilding Gaza, not for Hamas, they would say, but for what they would term the innocent civilians. Okay, let's assume every one of those facts happened exactly the way it did. Let's just change one fact. Let's assume the attackers on October 7 were not Palestinians. Let's assume they were Germans of another era, or Ukrainians of another era, or white South Africans. In other words, let's assume they were white people, not people of color. Okay, do you really think that Biden would have budgeted billions of dollars of aid to white supremacists who say Jews are apes and pigs? Of course he wouldn't. And now hold the thought. Let's carry the thought experiment all the way through. Let's assume, again, in this parallel universe, white supremacists in Gaza, not Arab supremacists, but let's assume they murdered 1,200 black people and raped black women. And then a Republican administration said, we're going to give billions of dollars of aid to the innocent civilians, the innocent white supremacists who say blacks are apes and pigs. Everybody would go nuts and be rioting in the streets. Right. So what's going on here? What's going on here is cognitive dissonance. When people have deeply held beliefs and then facts appear that contradict the beliefs, people change the facts, not the beliefs. The liberals feel very strongly about fighting racism. And now suddenly you have this very high profile conflict that pits people of color, the Palestinians, against a perceived white group of privilege, the Jews. The liberals are going to back the people of color because that's the way they're wired. Now, the problem is the facts don't even remotely justify it. So that's where the cognitive dissonance kicks in and they change the facts to fit the narrative. That's what it's all about.
Okay, so you hit 3 big points, and I'm going to go one by one. First, I'll just make an observation because you talked about Obama's history of making moral equivalences and that a lot of his donors were Jewish. In one of Peter Beinart's books, he wrote that he grew up with friends who were Jewish leftists who, in other words, Obama subscribed to J Street before there ever was a J Street. I don't know if you remember, there was a slaughter in a shul or a Beis HaMedrash in Israel, and they had pictures of tefillin on the ground with blood. And Obama came out and said the killing on both sides has to stop. So Obama, unlike Clinton, is an ideologue. And ideologically, he is pro-Palestinian. Now, you mentioned about whites, had whites attacked. So you remember, why did Joe Biden say he was running for president? Because of the Charlottesville. So in other words, when it's Hamas and their supporters chanting death to America, doesn't offend him in the least. But he got offended by the riot, by the mobsters in North Carolina. So now you mentioned about liberals and cognitive dissonance. And tell me again if you agree with me or disagree with me. There are 3 different categories. There are people of color, which I consider to be blacks. I don't consider people who have a tan complexion like Talib to be a person of color, but that's another story. You got people of color, you've got whites, but then you have the Jews. And the Jews are a completely different category, which is why I don't know that I go along with white, the Jews are associated with being white. What are your thoughts on that? That the Jews are their own category, not white, not even color, but they're just Jews, and Jews have been too powerful for too long. Therefore, their skin color really isn't the issue. It's that they're the Jews.
Well, you said a lot there. So first of all, you made an excellent point about Charlottesville. Remember how the left went nuts because President Trump said there were fine people on both sides.
Right.
And, in other words, he arguably, I stress arguably, drew some sort of a moral equivalence. Now, President Trump didn't say the attacker in Charlottesville was a fine person. He said there were fine people, which, technically speaking is true. And people went absolutely bananas. What Obama said was factually false. He said there was an unbearable occupation. There was no occupation. What he said was just not true. Right. And yet this was accepted as just another statement from the great man. So, I mean, it really does kind of hammer home this notion of cognitive dissonance again when it comes to race and racism and so forth. With respect to the Jews, so I get this all the time. People say, but what about Sephardic Jews? What about the fact that only 32% of Israel's population are European white Ashkenazi Jews? So the response to that is people of color and white, these are misnomers, okay? So when people talk about minorities, so sometimes Jews will say, well, we're a minority. What are we, a majority? Ha ha ha. No, when they talk about minority, they're not talking about Jews, okay? And here's another one. The Arabs often will say, well, we can't be anti-Semites. We're Semites too. It's nonsensical. That's not what anti-Semitism are. It's a misnomer. There's lots of these, okay? The Jews are perceived by progressives especially as a white group of privilege. And that means they're going to be demonized. And Zoran Mamdani, demonizes the Jews as well. And he dog whistles support for jihadist violence, globalize the Intifada. And I have to say, I mean, if we were talking about, Jim Crow, slavery, I'd probably find a lot of common ground with our liberal, friends and relatives. But it's just that this fact has nothing to do with Israel and Palestine.
Right.
I'd also just point out, back in the bad old days of lynchings, nobody said, I'm in favor of lynchings. They talked about states' rights. They talked about why should one murder be treated different from another. They dog whistled, and everyone knew what they were saying. They just didn't come out and say it. When you say globalize the Intifada, you're saying the exact same thing. It's just that because it plays into a bias of supporting people of color against a white group of privilege, it's falling on some very fertile ground. And that's what's really so dangerous.
I don't know if you remember, I think it was a couple of years ago when Randy Weingarten from the Teachers Association said that the Jews are part of the ownership class. So again, that was part of targeting Jews, that therefore we are privileged. So it goes back to my thinking that it's not about race, it's about the Jews just have way too much power. And so even if we are a minority, but we don't have the right to complain because we just make too much money and we control too many institutions. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that at all, but that's where I come from as far as where their anti-Semitism is derived.
Yeah, I don't remember Randy Weingarten saying that.
I do.
I do remember, though. I know I'm not denying
Yeah,
it. I
yeah.
just don't remember seeing the quote, but I do remember there was a guy who ran for city council a couple of years ago. I don't remember his name off the top of my head. He was a Hispanic fellow, and he said, "We've got to run against the Jewish landlords."
Yeah.
And remember that? And it was a fundamental part of his campaign, and he had a video, and it went viral. Now, yes, it did spark an outcry, and he was forced to step down. He didn't run again. But the point is, there's no question in my mind he was speaking for others. It's just you got to be smart enough to know to dog whistle this stuff. And, in America in the 21st century, you can't say you're running against Jewish landlords, but you can say globalize the Intifada. And then later, Mamdani is recoiling in horror, almost like that guy in the movie Casablanca. I'm shocked to believe that someone would think that I meant that I'm supporting violence. And then he tried to make some equivalence between Intifada and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It was kind of funny. But sadly, especially young people who are just so juiced on this notion of racism and white groups of privilege, there is a class of people, particularly on college campuses, that really go in for this sort of thing.
Another question I want to ask you, and I was debating how much time we're going to spend on it, about how October 7th happened. So in your book, you write about the conception. Am I pronouncing it the right way?
You are.
Conception that Israel, that this is never going to happen. Hamas is preoccupied with this. They're not really going to. And at some point there will be an inquiry. What the hell happened? But for me, it's hard to believe that they just didn't see it happening with all of the intelligence that Israel has. Forget about the reports that were ignored by the female soldiers who said that there's something going on. And I'm going to dismiss all that. With all of Israel's informants, with, everything that they know that's going on, with all of the propaganda, Hamas always calls for Israel's destruction. Did they really think that they were just pandering to a crowd there and that they weren't really planning something?
That actually is what they thought. And it was not irrational. I'll be honest, I thought it too. And practically everybody in Israel did. Here's the cold, hard reality. Under international law, while you're an occupier, you do have a responsibility under international law to assume responsibility for the health, safety, and well-being of the local population. Israel did this. It did it admirably. The lives of Palestinians improved by every material metric after the 67 war. Now, If you withdraw from territory, however, you give up that responsibility. Remember, Colin Powell said, the Pottery Barn rule, you break it, you buy it, but the corollary is you leave it, you lose it. So when Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, it could have just wiped its hands and say, guys, you're on your own. Now, the Israelis didn't do that. They became pretty much the only country, not even pretty much, the only country in the history of the world supplying their enemy in the middle of a war. So I looked it up in the last full year for which we have data, which is, of course, 2022, before the October 7th attack. Israel supplied Gaza with 5.7 billion gallons of water. Israel supplied Gaza with 67,000 trucks filled with supplies, 2/3 of its electricity, all of its fuel. 17,000 Palestinians worked in Israel to take home a paycheck. It would be as if, America let 17,000 North Koreans work in America to send supplies to Pyongyang during the Korean War. We don't even allow it today, let alone in the middle of the Korean War. But Israel did these things, and they did it. It was kind of like paying protection, but the thought was Israel was Gaza's economic lifeline. There's no way that the Gazan leadership is going to sit down and cut off that economic lifeline, give up all the food, the water, the supplies, and essentially make a conscious decision to commit an act of national suicide. Now, they did do that because they think differently than you and I think. Their number one priority is jihad. And they said after the attack, they were giving interviews saying things like, raise our kids, educate the kids. We don't care about that. We just want to kill the Jews. Our number one priority is jihad to the exclusion of everything else. This is why Iran is such a failed state. Ayatollah Khomeini once said, the revolution wasn't about the price of watermelons. And what he meant by that was, if I were to ask you, what is the purpose of government? You would say the purpose of government is to improve the lives of the citizenry. And then you'd say, was that a trick question? I mean, isn't that obvious? Okay, to us, it's obvious. But if you ask that question to Ayatollah Khomeini or Hamas, they would say the purpose of government is to wage jihad. It's to conquer Mecca and kill the infidels to the exclusion of everything else, which is why right now as we speak, there is not enough water in Iran. They are facing an existential crisis. You turn on the faucet, nothing comes out. Okay, there's rolling blackouts. It's a failed economy. There's 20% in unemployment, 40% inflation. They are still sending billions of dollars to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to Hamas, because that's the most important thing. The economy is a distant second. And it was the same for Hamas. The Israelis were thinking the way we think, not the way they think. That's really, and there was a concepcia. The concepcia said Hamas is not going to commit an act of national suicide. Something similar was what went wrong in the 73 war. Something similar, that's what always goes wrong. That's what went wrong in the housing crisis in '08. There were certain core assumptions that had always been true in the housing market that suddenly weren't, so the market collapsed. And just one other point, I mean, concepcias are part of the way humans think, and they're part of everyday life. You can't live your life without core assumptions. When you think about when you cross the street, okay, you assume, you have a concepcia, a core assumption that when the light turns red, the driver will stop. If the driver keeps driving, you'll get run over and you might get killed, as actually almost happened to me once back in 1988. Point being, you can't live your life without core assumptions. So it's very hard to overcome them. The real mistake for Israel was that though you have to have core assumptions, you also have to think about, but what if? And then you have to do a cost-benefit analysis. If they had just planned, they didn't even plan for a contingency where Hamas might attack, and that was really where the failure was. And that's why they've all resigned so far.
Except I'm surprised because, I mean, over the last bunch of years, 10s, 20, 30, 40,000 rockets were fired into Israel. So again, we could debate this all day long, and again, I'm waiting for the inquiry to come out. I want to come back to the point about progressives and how we got to this point. This idea of accusing Israel of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide, it didn't start October 8th. It's been going on for decades. And here's where I fault Jewish leadership, Jewish activists. Twofold. For years on college campuses, we ignored all the attacks against Israel because we thought, okay, people will dismiss them as these snot-nosed college kids. We allowed them to control the narrative where now it doesn't even matter more. We can tell the truth from today till tomorrow. It doesn't matter because we've allowed them to control the narrative for the last 10, 20 years. They accuse us of genocide, which is a bald-faced lie. We can prove it. Apartheid, ethnic cleansing. But it doesn't matter because we've been silent for so long. Just like AIPAC underestimated J Street, where now J Street owns the Democrats, we too, Jewish activists and pro-Israel activists, allowed them, the Islamists and jihadists, to define us, define the narrative, and now we can have all the Douglas Murrays we want and all the Mossab Hassan Yusufs and Yusuf Haddads. It doesn't matter because they're clobbering us because they own the narrative.
Well, I'm not quite as alarmed as that. I mean, luckily, it turns out the man on the street turns out to be a pretty smart guy. Israel is still way ahead in the polls, in all the polling. There is a growing faction in the Democratic Party, I admit, which is anti-Israel. But the fact of the matter is, end of the day, the surest way, the surest proof is, first of all, very, very few American politicians went to those college campuses to show solidarity with the protesters. There were a couple of progressives did, but the vast majority did not. In Congress, everybody tried to add an amendment to the aid bill to Israel because everyone knew how popular it was. Or here's another one, the Eurovision, which is a competition in Europe among musical acts.
Right.
It's very, very popular over there. It's not as well known over here. So they have a two-tiered voting structure. The public votes, and then there is a group of judges, and they vote. Right. So in the last year, I think it was in the 2025 one, Israel's act came in number one, first place among the public. It's just that then the judges dropped them to 13th place, so they came in second. The same thing almost happened in 2024. The public voted Israel in second place behind Ukraine. And then the judges again knocked Israel down. But the point is, there's no way that's a coincidence that, the public seems to like Israel. It's just that then there are the elites who step in and beat Israel down. And it kind of reminds me of a famous line from the Gordon riots, which happened in London in 1780. Someone said, I'd rather be governed by an ill-dressed mob than a well-dressed mob. The ill-dressed mob is for Israel. It's the elites. It's the academics. It's the progressives, again, because of cognitive dissonance, because they want to back the white group, the people of color against the white group of privilege, that always figure out a way to turn the truth on its head and come down against Israel. But I tend to be somewhat more optimistic. The public, for the most part, is just not buying any of this nonsense.
So let me ask you a question then, just your opinion, because I used to be very optimistic. I see what's happening in Canada. Canada is gone. Australia, all throughout Europe, in America even. I mean, I see us losing everywhere. So I'm looking to grab onto something to be optimistic about, but I'm just not seeing it.
Oh,
what am I missing?
I couldn't. Well, first of all, you're missing President Trump. I mean, ultimately.
Okay, yes, Trump is there now. But talk about the people, though. Trump is fantastic. He's got 3 years left. I don't know what happens after him, but I'm looking all over the world. I'm looking again, every country, and we're getting our butts kicked. Israelis go to hotels in Europe, and they're saying, we're not going to give you a room because you're Israeli. When they were in South, I remember some Israelis were going for a vacation in South America, and they got a call at 4 a.m. from the embassy, run because they're coming to arrest you. So Jews in New York are afraid to wear a yarmulke on the subway. They're afraid to wear, a mug and doublet. Okay, I wear here my necklace that says never again in Hebrew. But again, I'm a little bit of more of a tough guy. But people are afraid. And if they're afraid, that means that there's something going on that goes beyond President Trump being our president. Mamdani won in New York. Now, I know that Cuomo sucked and Curtis Leawood didn't have a chance. But still, he shouldn't have won.
So I mean, there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. Certainly Mamdani shouldn't have won. And it is a little alarming because, for people who wanted to go progressive, there were responsible people you could have voted for. Brad Lander, even Scott Stringer. Again, this is not my politics, but again, if you wanted to go that route, there were people you could vote for. You didn't have to vote for Zoran Mamdani. As far as, the countries you ticked off, you are correct. Those are all countries that have one thing in common. They all have left-wing governments. So, yeah, that's going to happen. First of all, I don't think any of those leaders, whether you're talking about Anthony Albanese, Mark Carney, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, they're not going to help the Arabs wipe Israel off the map. They'll take pot shots, but only to a point. And one other very important point, as much ground as Israel maybe is lost in Western Europe, and Western Europe is going through a very, very difficult period. There is the lack of a better word. There's just a certain rot. And I'm not the only person who
Right.
says this. That seems to have taken place. They don't seem to be. They have no economic growth. It's been flat for. They have a lost decade. They have fundamental structural problems they just can't seem to solve. France is going to be in a really bad place in a few years. It's just an actuarial table.
Right.
They can't afford their social safety net. And every time some president or prime minister tries to either raise taxes or cut benefits, the public starts rioting. They can't seem, which means, of course, with each passing year, the problem just gets worse. They can't seem to get a leader like a Maggie Thatcher or a Charles de Gaulle to just step up to the plate and solve these problems. But anyway, as bad as it is in Western Europe, that's how good it is in Central and Eastern Europe. Israel is wildly popular in Poland, in Hungary, in Serbia. I can even say in Germany and in Austria. Israel is wildly popular today in India for the first time. They're pivoting to the east. Israel's popular in China, South Korea, Taiwan, especially Singapore. There's parts of the world that are opening up to Israel that weren't there before. And it's for a simple reason. It's because oil just isn't as important as it used to be.
Right.
It's in steep decline, and the Arab world is in steep decline. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, as a supporter of Israel, I think it's a 2 or a 3. If you're an Arab, it's more like a 10 or 11. There's even an article that just came out in the New York Times how Saudi Arabia, their sovereign wealth fund, is in the dumps because it really feels like the kids got hold of the trust fund. They're investing in stupid things,
Hmm.
and there's not that much time left because the IEA projected that in 2030, just 5 years, we're going to have 113 million barrels of supply per day of oil, but only 104 million barrels of demand. So you got a 9 million barrel gap. First rule of economics, when supply and demand are paired at 100, you have stability. If demand suddenly jumps to 103, the price doesn't go up by 3%. It can go up by 20, 30, 40%. The problem for the Arabs is it's the same in reverse. If demand suddenly drops to 97, the price does not drop by 3%. It could go down to 20, 30, or 40%. So if you get in a world where there's 104 million of demand and 113 million of supply, the price of oil, it could drop into the low 40s.
Right.
Analysts say Saudi Arabia needs like $80 oil to balance the budget. Iran needs $110 oil. Where's it coming from? No one knows. It's not coming from anywhere. That's why MBS is so anxious to get a defense deal done now while he has something to trade. Everyone remembers what happened to Kuwait. If America didn't need the oil, it wouldn't have defended Kuwait. And they know this. So go out 10, 20 years. We don't need their oil. And now, Iran attacks Saudi Arabia. Are we going to go defend them? I'm skeptical. We all remember 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. While we need the oil, while we have interest, sure. When we don't need that oil, that's another story. That's why MBS is going to do what he has to get that defense pact.
Uri, do you have time for another question?
Sure.
Okay. In your book, you also spoke about the Red Cross. And this is something that's been really frosting at me. The Red Cross, World Central Kitchen, Doctors Without Borders. All of those groups have been active in Gaza. And I believe without any hesitation, they were all complicit, especially Doctors Without Borders, because they're operating in hospitals. And everyone knew that Hamas was hiding their weapons in hospitals. And I remember a doctor being interviewed, and she referred to Gaza as Gaza. I said, wait a second, that's how the Gazans pronounce it. So to me, these are not humanitarian groups who are just there to help, help the poor people who have, are defenseless. They were there to insulate, to make it harder for Israel to attack Hamas.
There's no question. I mean, the worst offender by far, was, of course, the United Nations, which is supposedly a humanitarian organization. And stop and think about this for a minute, okay? Israel is the only country in the history of the world supplying its enemies in the middle of a war. We never did this. Britain never did this. Barack Obama did not do this. When we fought Islamic State, when we fought ISIS, we didn't supply their cities. We besieged them. There's description in the Huffington Post, April the 29th, 2016, about how we were besieging Fallujah. We had by then starved 140 people to death. The rest of the city was making soup out of grass. Now, these things are legal under international law, and I'm not being critical of President Obama. I supported these things too. War is hell. Nobody wants to do it, but the way to save lives is to win, is to eliminate the Islamic States and the Al-Qaedas and the Nazis and so forth. But the point is, Israel was unique insofar as it was supplying humanitarian. All they said was they wanted to come up with a regime that Hamas not be able to steal it. So they came up with this thing, GHF, and they tried to create a kind of a clean zone where Hamas wouldn't enter. But here's what went wrong. The UN had the most boots on the ground as far as humanitarian assets. They boycotted it. They said, we're not going to help you if you're not doing it in a way that benefits Hamas. Now, stop and think about this. They're accusing Netanyahu of genocide for not supplying the food. He supplied the food. The problem was distribution inside Gaza. It was the UN that was refusing to distribute the food. So who's committing genocide? Who's committing the war crime? Israel, which doesn't even have to supply food under international law, but did anyway, or the UN, which refused to distribute the food inside Gaza. If anything was causing the hunger, it was the UN, it wasn't Israel, but yet it's Netanyahu who's facing arrest, for genocide, and the UN goes on business as usual as if nothing happened. It beggars the imagination. The whole thing's upside down.
Uri Kaufman, it's been an honor to have you. Thank you. I loved your book, American Intifada. I read it over 2.5 Shabbosim. I read it. It's a great book. I invite all our guests to read it. Is there people can get your book on Amazon? Do you have a newsletter or anything people can subscribe to follow you?
No, it's I'm not big on social media, unfortunately. The book's available on Amazon. Thank God, it's actually done quite well. They're still moving, and the response has been terrific. And I'd love to speak at a college campus. I'm going to be at UConn in January. If anyone has I do quite a few talks, but I especially like to reach out to college kids. So if anyone out there, I do believe in free speech, so I'm cheap. I work cheap. And it's been a privilege to be on your podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.
You as well. Thank you.